Thank you very much, Dr. Wells. I know we're expecting the conversations today to range from past to future, but it's helpful for us to ground the conversations today in Theodore Roosevelt's life and his times. So for those of you who may not know, my name is Eric Johnson. I'm one of the digital library catalogers and archivists here. I'm also currently acting as interim co-director of the center. And it's my honor today to briefly introduce the moderator of our first panel of the day, Clay Jenkinson. To many of you who have attended our symposiums in the past, Clay requires no introduction. But for those who may not have yet had the pleasure of meeting him, Clay Jenkinson is a celebrated humanities scholar who has devoted most of his professional career to public humanities programs, including lectures, symposiums, and documentaries on a range of topics, including most recently an appearance in Ken Burns' documentary, The American Buffalo. Clay is also the host of a podcast and website, Listening to America, and has recently been documenting his travels around the United States in his Airstream trailer, following in the footsteps of John Steinbeck's own travels around the nation. Clay has been involved with helping shape the Theodore Roosevelt Center since before its inception, and continues to be a great friend to the center and its staff. I can personally attest he makes great stuffing at Thanksgiving. I'm now pleased to turn the floor over to Clay to introduce the members of his panel and set the stage for their topic, Nature's Sanctuaries, Protection of Public Lands. Let's all give Clay a hand as well.
Watch it. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Dickinson State University. We're so glad that you're here, and those that are streaming from around the country and around the world, we're glad you're here. Just want to say that Mr. Warner's class from Dickinson High School is here, 20 students from the Government and Careers class. We're very glad you're here. I know you have to leave a little bit early, and we understand. Let's have a spirited discussion today. I just want to reinforce just for a moment what we just heard. Theodore Roosevelt was president for 7 years and 171 days. During that time, he set aside 230 million acres of the public domain as national park, national forest, national monument, national wildlife refuge, and national game preserve. No president has done as much as Theodore Roosevelt did in that way, although Jimmy Carter set aside more acres, most of them in Alaska. I want to just tell two quick stories about Roosevelt. In 1903, he went on a 24-state, 14,000-mile train trip around the country, the greatest presidential tour of the country up till his time, in a 7-car luxury train. In the course of that, he gave 250-some speeches, 5 formal and the rest spontaneous. And he was able to spend 2 weeks in Yellowstone National Park with John Burroughs. He spent 3 days with John Muir in Yosemite National Park. He saw the Grand Canyon for the first time. He saw the Redwoods for the first time. He saw the Grand Canyon for the first time on May 6th, 1903, and there was a plan to do all sorts of amenities development there on the South Rim. And he said one of the greatest things ever said of our public lands. He said, "Leave it as it is. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it." Leave it as it is. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it. And then 8 days later, he was in the Redwoods at Santa Cruz, the big trees there. And he was, of course, overwhelmed by them. But what he saw was that placards had been put up on some of the trees, labeling them, giving them cute names. Sometimes people exchanged notes on these trees. And when he saw that, he threw a little presidential fit and said, "This is not okay." He said, "I'm going to go for a long hike here, and when I come back, I'll decide whether I want to give my speech." And so when he left, they, of course, scurried and pulled down all of the placards. He came back and gave his speech, and he said this. He said, "These are our cathedrals. Europe has Notre Dame and Salisbury Cathedral and St. Peter's, but these are our cathedrals, and we must take as good care of them as they do of those extraordinarily important sacred places. This is the cathedral structure of the United States." So with that, just keep in mind that everything we do here at the TR Center is to try to explore and clarify the life and achievement of Theodore Roosevelt. He's absolutely central to this discussion. So let me start. You can read the biographies of our friends here, but Ryan, I'm going to start with you. Ryan Taylor, fourth generation rancher in North Dakota, also now Ducks Unlimited for the past 5 or so years. Give us a little perspective on this, and I really want all of you to wrestle with the question of sustainability. You know, if you asked the farmers of North Dakota, the ranchers, are you behaving in a sustainable way? They would almost all say yes. It depends on what you mean by sustainability, doesn't it?
Sustainability probably means something different to everyone, correct? And our ranch is near Towner in the north central part of North Dakota, and so it's a part of the country that Ducks Unlimited is pretty interested in because it's the prairie pothole region where 10,000 years ago, as the glaciers receded, we left all these shallow depressions and wetlands, and it's part of the great migration of waterfowl across our country. So when I think about sustainable, at least on our ranch in McHenry County, it's not that different than it was when the tribes whose ancestral lands it was were there. Not that different than when my great-grandparents came and homesteaded it. Cattle have a fairly light touch on the land that's really compatible with the work I get to do now with Ducks Unlimited. Cows and ducks get along great. But the wetlands are still intact, right? The grasslands are still in the same sense of management they were when the buffalo were here to some extent, especially if we rotationally graze them. And so the topic today is we think about this public sphere, right, of the role on lands. We're not too far from a wildlife refuge, which is a creation of Theodore Roosevelt's. North Dakota has more refuges for bird sanctuaries than any other state in the country. It has waterfowl production areas, which are part of that same system. It has land on our ranch that is under a conservation easement that I hay and graze, but is still in a natural state, and that's supported not only by our duck stamps that we may have bought or different funding sources. Game and fish, as public hunting is important. So there's public hunting on the land on our ranch on a portion with a little remuneration from game and fish through our license fees. So, it's an incredible mosaic. I think if Theodore Roosevelt came back, there's parts of it that he'd be very proud of, and parts that he would question, I think.
Well, we better follow that up. What would he question?
Well, I think the changes on the landscape in terms of how harmonious it is with the natural things. That Teddy Roosevelt is the one that believed in the keen delight of hunting on lonely lands, right? And the joy of a horse well ridden and a rifle well held. The places where we can do that, I think, are obviously less, right? As civilization marches on, as our population grows, and that's, I think, the challenge, for a lot of us in this group is balance, right? It's always hanging in the balance. And how do you find commonality between those things? I think a family can still live on a ranch and do something that Theodore Roosevelt would be very proud of.
Well, you do. You live partly in Towner and partly in Bismarck. Let me just ask 2 quick follow-up questions. One is, you mentioned North Dakota has more wildlife refuges than any other, 63, I believe, in North Dakota, and 2 of them are Roosevelt's. Stump Lake, which has been absorbed by Devil's Lake for the moment, and Chase Lake, which is one of the world's greatest pelican breeding grounds.
It is. So those are, number 3 and number 20 in his designations. And interesting thing, I think, Stump Lake, for instance, when it was designated as very important to the canvasback, which is the king of ducks, if you're into ducks. The canvasback is the king of ducks. And it was probably big enough that it was fairly valuable to market hunters at the time. So here's a role for the public to do something in the realm of protection, is to set aside Stump Lake for the canvasback, Chase Lake for the pelicans, and then begin this series of events that would say, and Roosevelt would agree, market hunting is kind of anathema to what we now call the North American model of wildlife conservation. You can't take a punt gun that's 10 feet long with 2 pounds a shot, kill 76 canvasbacks in one shot, and be in any way sustainable, right? So Stump Lake was kind of the start of that. And then everything else, you know, we buy duck stamps to go hunting. We have this North American model that's democratic. Everyone gets to hunt. It's not just a landed gentry, and it's not a market-based system.
So just one more question before I turn to Josh. So Ducks Unlimited, in some sense, owes its birth to the Boone and Crockett Club, which Roosevelt formed after he returned from his Badlands sojourn in 1887. His view was that if you don't protect these species, then your children and grandchildren won't be able to hunt them either.
Yeah, Ducks Unlimited started in 1937, so we've been at it for 87 years, and you know, they are conservationists in I think the truest form, but also realist, right, in how you do this. We're going to tax ourselves, we're going to support this in our own way, and we're going to support it politically as well. So, you know, Ducks Unlimited has got a wetlands mission. It helps folks, you know, channel some of their generosity into conservation, but doing that in concert with private landowners, along with what we'll all talk about today in the public sphere. 90% of North Dakota is owned by private landowners, farmers and ranchers, and our goal is to work with those folks that have a conservation mindset and an ethos, and make sure we can help them do the right thing that makes them sustainable and gives their kids a chance to continue that livelihood, but also gives the children of sportsmen and women and people who love the outdoors to see the things that we have.
So Josh Lefers, Audubon Society, you're South Dakotan from Corsica, South Dakota, and you grew up on a dairy and have a small ranch yourself. You know, Ryan mentioned grass. There are 11 million acres of grass in North Dakota, almost twice that in South Dakota. But we all know from reading Richard Manning's book and others that much of that grass is not native. Many of these species have been introduced, and some of them are noxious species. Talk a little bit about the health of the grasslands in the Dakotas.
Absolutely. Thanks, Clay. And thanks to the committee for inviting me. It's just such an honor to be here. Just as someone who, you know, when I was in college, I had The Man in the Arena taped on my wall all the way through college, and always saw Roosevelt just as quite an inspiration as a doer, right? That was a big thing that Roosevelt was a proponent for, was go out and do, don't just comment on it. And I think our country could use a little bit more of that these days, because it seems like everyone wants to commentary on what's going on. But when we talk about the health of the grasslands, first of all, when you think about 11 million acres in North Dakota, that's about a quarter of what was originally, North Dakota was essentially all the prairie state at one time. So we're looking at a quarter of our prairies being left in North Dakota. It's much worse in Minnesota, Iowa. We're a little bit better in South Dakota. We're about 50-50. But overall, you know, when you're in school, you'll hear a lot about rainforests, right? And we talk about that in the conservation community, this idea that just about every middle schooler can tell you about the loss of the Amazon. Well, the loss of the Amazon is very limited compared to the loss of our North American grasslands, and just the amount of grasslands that remain. And then on top of that, the grasslands that do remain are invaded both with these non-native grasses from Eurasia, as well as we're seeing a number of these grasslands become more and more invaded with woody species, both native and introduced woody species that essentially are unbounded now just due to controls on fire, a little bit of a shift in the climate just as a wetter cycle over the last 30 or 40 years. And some things we probably don't even fully know at this point, but just we're seeing these expansions of woody species. And so overall, even the grasslands that we have left, it's very hard to find a healthy, intact grassland ecosystem that can support our grassland birds the way that, you know, they've been evolving with these grasslands for, you know, at least the last 10,000 years since the glaciers receded in the eastern part of our states.
So let's just say we had the national will to restore the grasslands that we still have to their full health. I understand that's a very expensive sort of project and a very difficult one. What's being done to regain or regenerate the grasslands that were here, say, when Lewis and Clark popped through?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that we think about is, for one thing, protecting large blocks that remain. And we can thank our public lands really for maintaining some really big blocks. Now, those big blocks alone just cannot support robust populations of grassland birds. They're a great core and a great resource, but they're going to ultimately probably fail in maintaining the populations that we really need to see for good genetic diversity and the maintenance of these species. So what we're really focused on through Audubon, through Ducks Unlimited, I know Badlands Conservation Alliance is involved in this a little bit, is working with those stewards of our grasslands, which would be the ranchers. Because if you even think about most of our public grasslands, they are stewarded by private ranchers. And so being able to provide them not only the knowledge, right? How do you maintain these grasslands? How do you do what we like to say is what's good for the bird is good for the herd? And so how do you make sure that the management that you're putting on these ranches is beneficial not only for the wildlife, it's good for the soil, it's good for the grasses, but then it also is good for the livestock that you're putting on that. And a lot of that, Ryan touched on just grazing management. There's a lot of different ways to implement grazing management, and it's really important just to remember on our grasslands, specifically that they are disturbance dependent, right? If you leave a grassland and you don't disturb it in some way, and our general disturbances we think of are grazing, fire, drought. I believe there's another one, and I'm forgetting it right now, but we can also use mechanical these days, so haying or something like that, because as you remove the leftover grass from the previous growing season or the current growing season, you actually get that grass to refresh, regenerate, and you also create space for all these wildflowers, which are really, really important for a lot of our native species. And so grasslands, they aren't disturbed over time, they tend towards I guess what would be called a higher climax community, which would be shrubland for something like that. And just making sure that we maintain what are actually economically beneficial activities on grasslands in order to maintain them as functional grasslands is really important for conservation organizations.
One more question before I turn to Shannon. So Roosevelt was a rancher, had 2 ranches in the Badlands. He was a cowboy after a fashion and a hunter. He was also a thinker, and he wrote 4 books about his time out here. And in the first of those, he talks about grass. And one of the things he was proudest of was that he was one of the founders of the Little Missouri Grazing Association, because he believed that there must be some self-policing in the grass. He did not want the national government to play a very large role in that, but he wanted there to be some public-private partnership to make sure that the public domain remained healthy. And I think you believe that's a good model. Absolutely.
I think that, for one thing, when we think of our national grasslands and the grazers that are using it, that the ranchers, they are in many ways providing a service to the people. And then the other side of that is making sure that within that trust that the public is placing in you, that you are taking care of that resource to the best of your ability. And so that takes thinking, right? That's not just I can just turn my cows out on May 1st, June 1st, whatever it is, pick a bump on November 15th, and everything will be fine. Thinking more strategically about how can this disturbance get the most benefit possible from the presence of that livestock is really important, and that involves thinking, and that involves planning. And so this idea of grazing associations, of course, grazing associations are kind of all over the Western Dakotas to provide that model for planning out a grazing system to benefit not only the ranch and the livestock, but also benefit the grasslands and the wildlife that depend on them.
And some of that goes all the way back through Roosevelt to John Wesley Powell, who in the Arid Lands Report in 1878 proposed public-private partnerships for irrigation districts and also for grazing districts. So Shannon Strait, you're the executive director of the Badlands Conservation Alliance, which is now 25 years old. I know you are a huge lover of the Little Missouri River Valley and have been out there many, many times before you took this job. You claim to have walked the entire Mattahay Trail. I have some doubt about that, but still, we have no cam for that. But once you took this job, you needed to look at the Badlands with a new lens, which is what are the threats, how well are they doing, what are the opportunities, and what's the future of the Badlands. So talk a little bit about the change in your own thinking as you assumed this official position.
Yeah, I want to thank Dickinson State and obviously the TR Center for having us. I grew up in Minot. I grew up in a very unique mobile food business. And so we are consumers. We travel to events, we sell food, we produce a tremendous amount of waste. But my whole life, starting when I was a teen, I'd go out to the Badlands, I'd camp. I saw the transition. I had family members that worked in the oil boom in the 80s. I lived in Alaska for 10 years, moved home in 2011 because of a flood. And I'd continue out for that camping trip in western North Dakota, but I definitely saw the impacts from oil and gas development. Oil and gas development's been good for the state. And I think my thinking has changed a little bit over time, not just because of the nature of the work and working with Ryan and Josh, but visiting with ranchers, going to their house, sitting at the kitchen table, talking about those issues that are impacting them. But I've also got a tremendous history lesson as well. We're thankful for the public lands, for the national park, but that came at a cost as well, right? To those landowners that were, multi-generational, were ranching, grazing the land. They were seeing their lands kind of being taken from them. And simultaneously, right now, I'm working on a project with our indigenous partners. So the Mandan Hidatsa people in particular, this is some of their sacred land. I've spent some time at Standing Rock, the Killdeer Mountains, and unfortunate battle. The Badlands have a different perspective for them that's very traumatic. So even though I grew up in Minot, I work in the Badlands, I'm getting a daily education. And so I'm incredibly energized at the possibilities we have ahead. We're going to have oil and gas development for 50 years, the next 50 years, they're saying at least. But at the same time, we have challenges. There's no doubt about it. As Roosevelt would say, it's great to be optimistic, but you got to be a little bit practical and understand the landscape. And I feel like I understand this landscape much better than I did 16 months ago when I took this job.
So Roosevelt believed in sustained yield, particularly in the national forests. By the way, he designated 75% of the national forests of the United States. Just think of that. 150 million acres. We have about 195 million acres of national forest. He designated about 80% of them. He believed in finding a balance between economic development, which of course he greatly appreciated, but also saving what can be saved, or certainly treating it in the most sustainable way possible. That's the balance that is so hard to find, isn't it? How much oil activity can the Badlands survive? How many luxury ranchettes can the Badlands survive? How much development in Medora and its environs are good for the Badlands? How do you wrestle with Roosevelt's legacy? Because he's not what we would call a pure environmentalist, nor is he a pure developer. He really fought all of his life to find a lively balance between these two things.
Yeah, I think if you look at one of the main reasons why Roosevelt came to North Dakota in particular is he wanted to shoot one of the last remaining bison. And if you think about that in context of conservation and sustainability, we're all here naturally and thankfully because of his foresight. He talks a lot about that in his readings. And I think what he also talks a lot about in his readings is how if we live only in the present, we're probably doomed to failure. And I think at the present, within our work, we're very much seeing who are our leaders that are talking with foresight about the future. It's a challenge, I think, for all of us, Ryan, Josh, and I. Within our work, we drive a tremendous amount. So we are the consumers. We talk a lot about loving a place to death. but at the same time, we're all part of the problem, right? So what is our collective responsibility as well as our individual responsibility? I want to agree that the private-public partnerships, have great potential for us. And at the same time, I think we're going to get into this discussion of AI technology, virtual fencing, new tech that's coming along. Last week I was in Watford City on an ag and industry tour, and I was visiting with an employee of the Oil and Mineral Resource Development Department, and he was educating me a little bit on the horizon that is maybe unmanned oil wells. And within some of that development, are we then going to see a decrease in well footprints that are gobbling up some of our areas that provide habitat, threaten the landscape, obviously? But so I want to believe that there's some better balance that we can have. I also want to believe that we have leaders, some of you in the audience, students in the back, that are going to take us to a new way of thinking that leads us into a new generation for development in a more sustainable fashion. I want to be optimistic, but I think we have to be realistic about it. But we also have to, part of my work is watching not just the threats, but seeing what's on the horizon. I want to be optimistic about the Bureau of Land Management recently has elevated conservation to equal footing as extractive industries. But at the same time, there's a new BLM resource management plan that's maybe not taking into considerations of some of our challenges we've faced in the past with oil wells, and what do we do with them when they've reached their useful end life. So you, the public, these are your public lands, but we need you to be involved. If I can leave you with anything today, and I brought some other materials I can share with you that you can get more involved in the next couple of weeks and even months, and so it's also up to you.
So Ryan, I put up this map because you mentioned that there's very little public land in North Dakota, and this map really shows. I mean, look at Nevada, for example. 80% of the lands of Nevada are public lands. California, an enormous percentage. Alaska, of course, through the roof. We're a pretty small area of public lands. You started by talking about ethos, that the idea is that the ranchers and the farmers would themselves adopt the best practices. First of all, they have to know what those best practices are. Second of all, they have to know that they will in some way cash flow. And third, they have to work with neighbors. I have a friend who lives up in northeastern Burleigh County. They have a sustainability Angus ranch. During the big drought a couple of years ago, they got 50 bushel wheat. Their neighbors got 20. Their neighbors came and said, "Why'd you get 50 bushel wheat?" And they said, "Because we practice a certain type of agriculture." And the neighbors said, "Oh, we wouldn't do that. We've never done that. We don't even like the idea of that." So talk a little bit about generating an ethos of greater responsibility and breaking the notion we have that we're all doing just fine.
Well, like a lot of things, I think it takes a village, as they say. And, think of a couple programs that we can help deliver. And Natural Resource Conservation Service is a good partner for producers out on the land. And they talk about technical assistance and financial assistance. So that's exactly what you just said there. The technical assistance is, at DU, we hire as many agronomists now as we hire biologists. And so they can go out across the kitchen table, talk to producers, especially in those diversified farms and ranches in the middle of our state, about how cover crops can not only help rebuild the tilth of the soil and add nutrients that aren't costing you money and out of your pocket, but can also help rebuild that soil that we've depleted over the years, and at the same time improve water quality in the wetlands that are embedded on your farm and ranch. So less sedimentation, healthier wetlands. They can talk to folks and then offer financial assistance. Cover cropping is somewhat new in some places of North Dakota, and the seed can be expensive and how to implement it, so there's financial assistance in the cost share. Same with the rotational grazing, as Josh mentioned, and we've done this on our ranch for 15, 20 years now, where it requires more fence, and that's the financial assistance part. But also the help from someone who's might be a range scientist that just really geeks out on this stuff about, goodness, Ryan, look at that big blue stem, and we're all just kind of weirded out and loving it. But that's the technical side of it, and we know that those many multiple species of grass allow my cattle to gain better, the cows to breed better. and everything is kind of in sync again, naturally. But it's a matter of both the know-how and sometimes the financial part of it as well.
But I really want you to wrestle with this for a moment. I think there are 29,000 farms and ranches in North Dakota. Do you think that on the whole, that community is moving towards more sustainability or not?
You know, you pick up any farm and ranch magazine right now, and you're going to see the word sustainable in it 1,000 times probably. So we know that society is demanding this more and more. We know that our food consumers are demanding it more and more. They want to know the story. Actually, this next weekend, I'll be on the Angus tour that's up in north central North Dakota. We'll be near Gray City at the Spickler Ranch. We actually, as DU, partner with Certified Angus Beef, because Certified Angus Beef talks to their customers and the grocery stores and the restaurants that sell their product, and they say, we want to know more about your product and how it is raised and how it's in sync with nature. And like Spickler's as one of our partners, our group or a family that we work with, they're still on the land, and we're able to talk about their rotational grazing system, their cover cropping, all those things, how the wetlands are healthy on that operation. And CAB in turn will help tell that story to their customers, and then we just need to replicate that over and over. So it's a continuum, right? I can't say that 29,000 farms are all up here or down here or somewhere in between, but more and more we're working to get there, and it takes many hands for this work, and we're joined by a lot of others in that effort, along with the ranchers themselves and farmers too.
I want to make sure we have time for questions from the audience, but Josh, all of us are concerned about the meadowlark, the dramatic drop in meadowlark numbers across the American West, particularly in the Great Plains and here in North Dakota. Can you unpack that a little for us?
Well, first of all, when you think about a meadowlark, who would have guessed, right, that we'd be concerned about it? Meadowlark has been ubiquitous as a grassland bird across the Great Plains, and now I don't have the map, but if you look at a map of just presence absence of western meadowlark over the last 50 years, pretty close to half of their range, largely in the east, they just aren't found anymore. And so a lot of that has to do with habitat, and that's habitat both in their breeding range here in the Great Plains as well as in the winter. Meadowlark is pretty unique too in that it will winter actually farther north than some of our other grassland birds. And when we think about meadowlarks, yes, we've lost a lot of meadowlarks. But meadowlarks, we refer to them as thunder chunks because they're really, like they sit up on a post, they're really loud, really easy to see, and then they're really chunky, so they're easy to find. But there are a lot of our grassland birds that are faring much, much worse than meadowlarks. That require maybe more specific habitat requirements. Meadowlarks are still pretty generalist when it comes to grasslands. As long as they have grasslands and a decent diversity in that grasslands, they can thrive. But yet we're still seeing a tremendous decrease, and so in many ways they can be, for us, just a test species, right? A species that we can, indicator species that we can use to say that, yeah, our grasslands are in trouble because the meadowlark's in trouble.
But is it habitat encroachment? What are the main reasons?
So it's habitat loss through the loss of grasslands to a variety of resources. It's including tree encroachment. Grassland birds don't really like tall structures. I mean, that's just the reality, and that includes trees. And when I say a tall structure, that's anything over about 6 feet, 2 meters tall. Some of them are more sensitive than others. And once you get to 3 meters or 10 feet, then you really start running into sensitivities. Because that's just not something they were used to historically on grasslands. And so now when you drive, I just drove across a good portion of the western grasslands yesterday on my way over here. Between telephone poles, trees, windmills, and I'm talking even the small ones on the farm, right? All of these different structures are now creating, in many ways, a hostile environment for many of our species. And so having an open space, even if it's grass, if we have some of these taller structures, that's going to impact the species. But then it's the straight up loss of the grasslands, whether it's for cropping systems, ranchettes, oil and gas extraction, invasion of non-native species. It could, there's a whole list of things that's chipping away at that grasslands. Nationwide, on a yearly basis, we're losing about a million acres of grasslands. And
A year,
A year.
nationwide.
Yep, that's what the data has told us for at least 20 years, is nationwide we're losing 1 million acres of grasslands.
Did you say thunder chunk?
Thunder chunk,
Tell us what that actually means.
loud like thunder, because you can hear them. Like you
Where's
drive
the
by
chunk
at
in
full
this?
They're chunky. You ever see them? They're really fat.
You don't have to get personal. I mean, that's their style.
Well, I'm not trying to disparage them.
Don't-
It's
don't
just,
fat shame the-
It's a
You're
term
fat
of
shaming them?
endearment.
So, and let me ask another question. In 6 states, the meadowlark is the state bird. In South Dakota, the pheasant. Justify that.
I
That's an
can't.
invasive species.
I can't justify that. We've been working on that, but it's a very economic, it's an economic driver, so it's a thing.
Oh, we
I-
have
I
them
can't
here too,
justify
but
it.
we don't put them on the flag.
I understand.
So you will not try to justify that.
No, I'm not going to
No,
try and
okay,
justify
good.
the pheasant as the state bird.
So, all of you, but starting with Ryan, we were talking a little bit back, and you were talking about virtual fencing. So we all know this from our dogs and our yards and so on. You are, in some respects, absentee at times because you do a lot of work in Bismarck, and you were kind of eager for the coming of the virtual fence. First, explain what it is.
So the technology, there's been a lot of technology in crop agriculture, but we're starting to see more in livestock agriculture. And virtual fences, like it sounds, there's no fence on the landscape, no physical fence, except a perimeter fence to keep them off the highway, right? And then for your rotational grazing, you break it up on the computer. There's a collar on the cow, and if she gets close to the limit, there's a beep, and then if she gets a little closer to the limit, there's a shock that's lighter than what we get on an electric fence. But it trains them to stay within their space and still go to water. And then when you want to move them, you just move them on your computer. They go to the new place, and then if they try to go back to where they were, they get that same beep and shock. So it's giving that rest period and allowing you to rotationally graze. Interesting, a friend of mine who grazes on the refuge up near Upham is anxious for this because he gets to graze within their parameters on that land. But it's very hard to fence. It's fairly wooded along the Mouse River. He can actually graze that, do good things for the habitat there without building fence, and they don't want physical fence on there either, but they can do it with these collars, and it's a kind of technology that I think is attractive to the younger generations of ranchers to help maybe draw them back in to the business of grazing cattle.
It may draw them back in, but it doesn't necessarily put them on the land, does it?
Not necessarily. So like we were at Jorgensen's down in Ideal, South Dakota, so they're on the land managing virtual fence. I could be, I suppose, off the land at Bismarck, 130 miles, about 2 hours, 5 minutes, and 38 seconds away, generally, and know where my cows are, which is an important thing to keep peace in the neighborhood. But I think there's going to be a mix of these things. Josh and I were talking about game cameras. For $120, I can put a camera up next to a water tank, get a picture every day, and find out that my cow still got water, and still maintain the few thousand acres we got in our family, kind of do other things, make sure my kids can go to college, and maybe they'll come back to that ranch, we hope. But I think it's going to take technology to make it viable, and also maybe help them market the things that they're doing, these ecosystem goods and services. It's going to require technology to take it to the marketplace and hopefully get rewarded for it.
But I think in some important respects, you're a Jeffersonian. You believe in being on the land, walking the land, riding the land, checking the cattle. You could be in Oahu with your virtual fence and your stock tank cam. Isn't this eventually just going to empty out the land even more than ever? I see it as a mixed blessing, don't you?
It can be, right? So the internet, can be good and evil, right? It can be used to send pictures of your grandkids, or it can be used to plan a terrorist plot, right? So So, there's going to be good and bad. And if I was in Oahu watching that camera, I'd probably be one of the sadder people in Oahu, because eventually I would want to get back to that ranch. And so I think there's a limitation of you still want to be on that land, and I'm there every 4 or 5 days, and there'll be a balance. But also, if you don't have those kind of technologies that I think keep grazers on the land, it could all be turned into something else that is not grassland, and that would be a loss for us as a state.
Oh, and of course, fencing is incredibly expensive too, traditional fencing. Shannon?
Thank you. That's what not to get into your finances, Ryan, but what does it cost to fence a mile of ranch land?
Oh, thousands of dollars, and virtual fence can be done for, $35 a cow, basically.
And I'll just quick add here, when you think about the technology, a lot of the challenge we have with ranching families is being there, right? The work-life balance that ranches have faced over a number of years, and the ability, I don't see, no one gets into ranching because they love technology at this point, nor because they love people usually. They get into ranching because they love the land. And so having these simple tools that can help them impact, like have positive impact on the land, while also being able to go to their kids' game in town, or take a vacation for the first time in 10 years. I think that's really important for keeping people on the land, or getting the next generation to the land, because the next generation is going, Dad never left. He was always on the ranch, and that's just not something that I can see myself doing. I grew up on a dairy farm. That's what I saw. Dad was always milking cows. I said, I can't, that's just not the way I want to be. Yeah, even though it was a great way to grow up, I will admit that, and I'll say that over and over again. It was a great way to grow up. The other thing I think of, just from the benefit of the ecology, or from our public lands, is not having that infrastructure out there is actually really good for wildlife. We can manage these livestock in a way that's going to benefit the rangelands without putting these physical barriers out there that could impact. Pronghorn antelope is a really big one that is impacted by fences. But even you think about all these fence posts that are across the land, and how that impacts these variety of bird species, or fences and the impact that they have on sage grouse. I could go on, but the ability of having the infrastructure to manage the grasslands without having physical infrastructure is actually a really big deal, and even more so on public lands, where we don't necessarily want to have all that infrastructure.
Although the meadowlark does love a fence post, I can verify.
You're not putting a collar on the meadowlark, are you?
Someone probably has, because they can map it and see where they go in the winter.
So Shannon, one last question before we turn to the audience. If you look at this map here, so we say 5% of North Dakota is federally owned. That's a bit of a misnomer, because much of that is Native American reservation. And there's a federal trust relationship, but it's not federal ownership of that land. Those are sovereign lands of the Lakota and the Ojibwe and the Mandan, the Hidatsa and the Arikara and the Assiniboine. You mentioned earlier Native American cooperation. And if you think of the national parks and the national monuments and the national forests, much of that was taken from Native Americans without consultation. And Roosevelt was one of the chief proponents of that. He didn't do it on purpose, but he wasn't too concerned either about the Native American sovereignty questions. Talk a little bit about opportunity in working with Native Americans to find a future, because of course they understood sustainability in a way that white people just don't.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Clay, because I think if you go back to Roosevelt's speech at the Grand Canyon, in particular, at the end of the speech, he actually recognizes the Native American sacrifice that was made in the war that helped him to better understand the people that he didn't know a lot about. Obviously, like all of us, we have checkered histories like TR does, but I think the opportunity that we have before us, maybe it's as a result also of oil and gas development, and MHA, for example, has tremendous wealth currently. We have new opportunities to learn from them. And I hope that as we talk about the Presidential Library being finally opened, that we can have a new story that's also told that I'm ignorant of, and I have to admit it, I went to Minot Public School, and we have a lot of lessons that we can learn, and it's much different because our Western way of life in terms of ownership and owning land and working land Native Americans' idea of the land is much different spatially, temporally. So we have a lot that we can learn, and I'm really hoping that over the next couple of weeks and months that you're going to hear more about that as we work on some conservation and sustainability projects. But the other thing I wanted to talk about within virtual fencing and what Josh was saying is, if the reason we talk about the importance of the grasslands is what's under the ground is more important than what you see of grass on top. The long root system of grass is storing carbon naturally. And as we're talking about global warming, our ranchers have a tremendous story that they can tell, but they need us to help with that. The idea of virtual fencing, there's an upfront cost currently. That cost is going to come down over time. But with the idea of rotational grazing, there can naturally be beneficial health benefits to our grassland that can naturally come that helps our grassland birds. It helps with our cows. The cattle are also healthier. The input cost for ranchers can be less. But the next iteration of it that we need to work on, to Ryan's point, is we need to eat more locally if we're really going to talk about sustainability and conservation. So that's something you should ask yourself about when you're out in the public is, where's your food coming from?
Yeah, a good endorsement for Fleischkekler. Who has a question here? Yes, right in about the fifth row, young woman. Yes.
Give me a second, we'll get you a microphone.
All right.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. So I inherited some land on the northwest bit of the border in the state that my great-grandparents purchased, and I've learned a great deal about the wonderful interrelationship between Ducks Unlimited, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and in this particular example, the PLOTS program, the private land open to sportsmen program, which you don't, it's 3 different tiers. You don't ask permission, you list your land to have permission asked of you, and then you can put up no trespassing signs, but you have to have your whole family agree if you want to be listed, which is always kind of a trick. So the question is, Clay, the question is, to what extent do you market this? It's a tremendous program, as is the fact that there is a 2-week window every April in which one can shoot white Canadian geese in an unlimited fashion, which is unique among the duck hunting world. So, and that provides sustainable food for a year or more for families, as does hunting of all sorts, as does the free hunting program offered by the state of North Dakota in January. So to what extent do you advertise all these wonderful programs? And they really are wonderful, between yourselves and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Ryan, I think that's one for you.
Yeah, I think North Dakota Game and Fish administers the PLOTS program, and they put out the catalog every year. There's some 900,000 acres, close to 900,000 acres in the program. They put it on their website. You know, we obviously want to get word out there as well. And all of this is part of this science-based management of a public resource, right? And when our scientists are monitoring the breeding grounds in Canada and when populations get excessive, as you mentioned on the white-fronted geese, that our scientists can say, here's what the harvest level ought to be, and then it's a matter of having people that are willing to get out as sportsmen and women to do that, and it's part of their hunting heritage. So we do it with magazines and websites and partners at Game and Fish and word of mouth. So we can all help with that.
And of course, on the public lands, we're all entitled to go on them more or less at will. We own them. 1.2 million acres in the Badlands alone is Little Missouri National Grassland, which is a commons, which belongs to every American citizen.
So public resource, and it's democratically available, small d, to sportsmen and women, because it's not just for the landed gentry. This isn't the country of fox hunts and red jackets here.
Which is, by the way, one of Roosevelt's most emphatic purposes, that he did not want the national parks and the public domain to be turned into private enclaves for the aristocrats and the privileged. He wanted a small d democracy in our national parks. Another question. Yes, here. He'll bring a microphone.
Fertilizer. It can be friend and foe. You know, I love my oatmeal with flax on the high side, but then as it drains into the rivers and streams, there's a lot of those that I would never eat a fish out of. So how is that being addressed, and maybe what would Theodore Roosevelt, where would he stand on something like this?
So nitrates and fertilizer running off into our groundwater.
So, quick stab at it, no farmer or rancher should want to do it excessively. Sometimes we do. We do it on our lawns in town as well, and it runs down the street curb and it all finds itself in a waterway. And that's what's created the dead zone at the mouth of the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico, where now there's no sea life anymore. So I think scientists can tell us ways to manage that. I think there's things we can do on our lawns. We can do more of a zero-scape. We don't all need to have this manicured lawn that has about a 3-inch root depth and Kentucky blue stem on our lawns versus 10 feet like a big blue stem. And then we do work, I think, on the farm landscape too. Wetlands are nature's kidneys. We keep those wetlands out there. We can actually purify the water along with, mitigate floods and recharge aquifers. Buffers around some of these wetlands are waterways so that they don't find their way into the waterways and just better use, more efficient.
Yeah, and I think as you look, my work in western North Dakota, and you look at the Little Missouri River in particular, there's been a couple of movements afloat to add additional protections to it, but it usually fails. The most recent Bureau of Land Management, Resource Management Plan, for example, had an option in there that would have added additional protection to it, and of course it was pulled out. The threat that we face in western North Dakota with the grasslands is, we're such a predominant, strong agriculture state, and the ag subsidies that exist right now, crop insurance protections, it's more economical to put your ranch land into row crop ag because you're going to get some financial security protections from it. And so as we see our dwindling grasslands potentially go into row crop farming, we have to be more mindful of what's going into the Little Missouri. So that's something that I'm trying to monitor more. But the governor formed, it's called the Little Missouri Scenic River Commission that meets once a year, has absolutely no teeth. But we get together and we talk. And that's what we do really well in our state.
Eric, let me know when we get to the last question. Myron Just, there's one right here in the third row.
Well, it seems to me we're making progress. I farmed for 30 years in Lemoore County. I went to NDSU 50 years ago in the 60s when the emphasis was on maximum productivity and everything. By the time my farming son went in the 90s, he got a degree in crop system, and the emphasis was really totally on sustainability. And so I think and I've seen farm programs shift with major emphasis now on conservation instead of price supports. The crop insurance programs, I think, are still geared a little bit too much to crops. But my son says he would like to get his soils into shape so that with minimum tillage and so that he get enough building organic matter and tilth in the soil so that a 2 or 3 inch rain would be totally absorbed instead of running off. And we've learned a lot over the years. In the 50s, we did soil bank programs and others, and we mineralized the soil by controlling weeds. Now we can, with CRP and other things, we have just really changed farming approaches, farming techniques, and I personally think, I'm 82 years old, I've seen tremendous change in agriculture, and I think it's really consciousness and awareness that's really moving that.
The farm program, of course, is working its way through Congress now. We'll see what that comes out to. We're out of time. I want to ask Josh, you to answer this question because these are two North Dakotans and we want to be careful here. But since you're a South Dakotan, you can speak freely. How well is your government, that is the state government, the legislature and the governor and the people in important appointive and elective offices, and your national team, your delegation, how much are they on board with these ideas of greater sustainability, restoration of grass, better practices, and so on? Are they leading following, getting out of the way, impeding? How would you assess them? I'm sure it's a little bit similar to North Dakota.
Sure. I would say overall leading, but you win some, you lose some. That's really what it comes to in most politics. And specifically last year in the state legislature, they passed House Bill 605, which happens to be our, it wasn't a bill, it was actually a concurrent resolution, excuse me. Concurrent Resolution 605 happens to be our area code for South Dakota, which basically just recognized the importance of grasslands on the landscape and the need of maintaining those systems, those ecosystems on the landscape. And that was a big step. I mean, even if you can get the unanimous, I think it was unanimous except for one, in the state to say, yes, grasslands are important. They're important to our state bird, which, you know, we hunt.
Had to bring it up.
Yeah, I did. But they're important to all of our wildlife. They're important to our waterways when we're talking about nitrates. They're important to our soil health when you talk about soils and maintaining the soil health. They're just an important component. And so that we saw in our state as a really important step forward, and we hope to use it to continue to protect and restore and improve management on our grasslands. And at a national level, we've seen similar support from our senators and our representative.
Very nice. So Shannon, I will see you on the Mattahay. There are new sections, as you know. Ryan, I will meet you in Oahu anytime you want, and we'll study your virtual fencing from there.
We'll sit on the beach and look at our phone on the couch.
Exactly. Oh, no, one got out. And Josh, thank you for coming all that way. And one of the joys is the drive from your part, Corsica, to Dickinson. It's one of the great drives in America. So I wish we had more time. Let's appreciate our three great spokespeople here.